Hello
Okay.
everyone, my name is Hemant Das and I'm a Senior Research Associate at South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. Today I will be talking with a person whose research and work I really admire. He is Shubhanshu Singh. He's a Dalit right activist and a former Joint Secretary of Jawaharlal Nehru University Students Union. Shubhanshu Singh's field of interest is social science and political issues. For this, he has completed his PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. During the last 2 years, he has worked for various social science issues and political issues through the movement and students' union organizations. His interests are diverse and include India and Dalit politics, culture politics, and politics for naming and education. Who does not know about the Chamar? Chamar is a Dalit community classified as a scheduled caste under the modern India's systems of affirmative action. Historically subject to untouchability, they were traditionally outside the India ritual ranking system of castes. Chamars who have adopted the weaving profession and abundant tanning and leather craft. So, without any further ado, let's get started with the question. Mr. Singh, while going through your research review and research reviews and some of your tweets, it is really interesting to find out that you're working on the subject that we rarely find. So my question is the practice of naming communities, especially the Dalit communities, and how the naming process defines social standing and social roles. What made you realize the importance of the practice of naming?
I think I'll start from the Indian naming system, which is very much prevalent in our Indian society, and how it get some solidification or some reasonable ground from these naming rules and regulation or norms comes from. So, as I start my work from looking into the texts which prescribe naming rules in Indian society. And as you know, Indian society as is majorly dominated, or you can say is majorly present into the Hindu, the Brahminical notion, which is very Vedic time concept, and most of the people still now carry out or following that Vedic tradition. So one has to ask and one has to inquire how the naming system India evolved over time, and what are the basis of unequal naming system, or the naming system, casteist naming system in India. So there are two texts basically from Hindu religious order. One is Greh Sutras, where different household activities and ceremonies were defined, and how the naming consideration were divided into the distinction between gender as well as on the caste. So they have a qualified caste criteria and consideration while adopting a name or while giving a name in a naming ceremony, which mostly called by namakaran in Hindi or in Sanskrit language. So there are two texts. One is Greh Sutra and another one is Manu Smriti. Manu Smriti goes forward and prescribes some punishment also if the naming rules which is prescribed in the Vedic or Hindu order literature is not abide by. So that is also one text which needs to be studied and observed. So, and through this I want to argue, or I want to present the view that in India, in naming system, caste is important criteria as defined by Vedic literature and Hindu religious order texts. So one has to contest it when we live in a modern secular society. So I think caste as a criteria and caste as a social stratification or social division of the society needs to be questioned, because these are the primordial identities, these are the ancient identities, these are the power structures in which caste situate itself. So from there and because there is a lot of debate on whether Dalit as a whole was a part of Hindu system or not, or is it just the societal norms which were going on into the Dalit communities, and the hegemonic and the dominant cultural and religious practice penetrate into their local and their own culture system. So I think that is one argument from where I come and says that the naming system on the basis of caste in India needs to be questioned, and it has to be questioned from getting the knowledge and from getting that written prescription for naming from these two foundational Hindu texts on naming. So that is one point from where I am coming. And then there are British census proceedings, which has their own objectives and their own goals to cater. And because of British colonial state was also powerful in that sense that it also wants to control the Indian society by ideological means, also by theorizing something which was not theorized in such a manner in a modern era. So census studies is important where, like I specified on the one community, and that is Chamar. And if you start from the first British census, that is 1871-72, it talks about how Chamars are being regarded as a Hindu semi-Hindu community. And then afterwards, in subsequent census, it also talks about how they are they are the part of the Hindu social order, but more on like the role of a slave, not equal stakeholders or equal participant in the Hindu social order or the cultural system. So that is another text or another literature from the naming system of India, which is caste, needs to be underlined or highlighted. So that is my first argument. And then, of course, within religious, within Dalit communities, there are different uh, adaptation. There are different ceremonies, or because in 1920s, as I also talk about a subsection or subgroup of Chamar Jatavs, and there are a whole lot of gamut of Hindu revivalists or social reformers who talks about how Sanskritization is important, and where they societal system is not based on the inequalities of the caste, but is more on the wrong interpretation of the text. And Arya Samaj was one of the leader organization of that, and which results into the Sanskritization of many Dalit communities, including Jat communities. And the time period is around 1920s, the same time period where British was also gaining their strong political footholds into the Indian political system. So that's where the other stage where a naming system of India, and how Indian society and how Dalits were struggling to get into that order, or the other Hindu revivalists and Hindu social reformers wants to give them alternative mythological root and some sort of religious grounding to have a upper mobility in the social order. But after a while, because it's Sanskritization and caste is so important and so strong that that upper mobility didn't happen. And but it did result into a positive development where Dalits, Jatav Dalits specifically, have mobilized themselves for their political demand. And their political demand first says that they have to, or they wanted their name to be changed from Chamar to Jatav in the official recording of British government, of that then British government. So that is one thing where I come from, and how engaging how Dalit communities also wants to question the caste name given on the basis of the occupational or traditional hierarchy. So that is one thing I want to locate my work on.
Honestly, that is really interesting to find that most of the people talk about the genetic thing about the Dalits and Adivasi, but nobody goes into deep to talk about such the naming practices. So with that, my second question is, how do naming practice with Dalit communities reflect historical and ongoing caste discrimination in South Asia?
I think because naming structure is one, or naming is one thing that exists in a contemporary society also, and name decides what your social location is. And whenever you recall any name, any personal name, it has some political meaning attached to it. And that is one argument what I am making. And to consolidate it, I want to bring up two Dalit communities. One is Jata, as I talked about, and another one is Ravidasia, which also talks about how our separate identity or separate religious identity is also important to gain that autonomy where one can name oneself. So that is main division where names are in one category, names are given, and there are some categories, and there are some instances where communities mobilize themselves to rename themselves. And of course, the main reason behind it, as in the Dalit communities, why they were renaming the caste name, their earlier traditional caste name, because there is some stigma attached to it, there is abuse attached to it, there is derogatory nature attached to it. So it was but natural for the Dalit communities to contest that traditional naming system and traditional naming rituals, and to adopt a newer version of naming which define themselves uh, in Indian society into a new picture where Dalit have named themselves. And Jatav is one, Ravidasi is another, and there are other communities as well within Dalit ambit and Dalit group, where the different groups have adopted their own name, and it is, I argue, is a sense of resistance to the naming system at large. So in as your question is, in brief, I want to say that how Dalit communities engage with the naming system in India is precisely about resisting the old and traditional and casteist nature of naming within Indian society or Indian political system at large. So that is one focus I want to carry out.
So it means the naming is something that symbolizes the social standard of the Dalit people. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
socialist,
So
or the Dalit consciousness, as we call time and again. And it's a good example of how Dalit have realized that their names are not being equal, and they are given by different section of the society, or who is the dominant or powerful section of the society. So it's a good realization, is a progressive realization, where one realize that his or her or their name is not according to its own individuality or its own description or its own assertion. So I think it's more of assertion, it's more of resistance, and it's more of Dalit consciousness and Dalit movement. And Dalit movement also talks about it at some point, and I want to focus at these specificities and these focused study where Dalit movement, whether it's Ravidasya movement, whether it's Jatav movement, tries to engage with that naming, unequal naming system.
So, as you mentioned about the British time and era, how do you think the naming practice within Dalit community has have changed over the time? How has the caste system influenced the naming practices within Dalit community or any other community?
Of course, it can be seen into two ways, where Dalit have their different opinion and standpoint, and the other caste or the higher or the intermediate caste will have a different take on the naming system because of the privilege or the power position they are having because of a certain or specified naming system. For example, the higher caste will have to defend or to argue for the naming system which is defined into the Hindu religious order, because their names are having, even now, are having higher value than the other intermediary or Dalit and Adivasi, and even the gender female, because it is also defined in that it's a Hindu social religious order, that how female name should represent some characters, and how male names should represent the dominant character. And likewise on the caste also, how lower caste, so-called lower caste name should have some sense of that downgrading or that stigma attached to their name. But on the other hand, higher caste will have names which represent their casteist character, whether it's bravery, courage, whether it's knowledge, and that philosophical brahmanical connotation, and likewise, so because there is a gradation of occupation, there is gradation of society on the basis of it, there is a gradation on the basis of naming system also. So but natural, I think, for Dalit communities is it became imperative to contest it, uh, to adopt a newer naming system. And I also want to include Ambedkar's argument in it, because he also talks about little bit, and in portion in different writings, where he talks about protective discoloration. Now he was talking about protective discoloration in the sense that many Dalit communities are renaming themselves at that point of time, in early 19th century and 20th century. But he says that renaming oneself into the larger ambit of Hindu social system or social order will not cater the needs and requirements what Dalit communities want, because it will result into the more degree of atrocity when you rename your caste name or your personal name, which represent the casteist character of Indian social structure. So he argued that when you rename your name or personal name with some contestation with the older caste belief, then the higher caste will treat you with more atrocity, or with more discrimination, because you have contested that system where one is above the other. So but he talks about the goals and objective of renaming, and says it will not cater the needs and requirement of Dalit communities until and unless the naming adopted will be adopted outside the ambit of Hindu social order. And that's why he calls for the conversion at one point of time to another faith or another belief system, that is Buddhist or more Ambedkarite Buddhist tradition.
Yeah. No. How do you feel about the name that you have been given? And do you think it reflects your identity or caste status? Can you describe the naming practices, tradition within your community?
Yeah, because even my work is more is more a derivation, or is more motivated my own personal experiences, because I belong to a Dalit communities, and my name is Shubhanshu Singh. Now Singh is mostly and popularly used by the Rajput community, and as I pose the example of Jatav community, so there is a Chhatrization. There is Sanskritization, but within Sanskritization, there is a Chhatrization also, where different alternative mythologies were created in order to give the claim to Jatav community, in order to adopt that Kshatriya identity, or in order to try for that Kshatriya identity. However, it has failed over a time because of the unequal nature of caste itself. So my name is Singh, and I as I personally experience that many people will ask you about your surname in Indian society in day-to-day life, that it, that they will ask you first what is your name, but if you don't mention your surname, then the second question, and most probably and in most cases, it the second question is about your surname, what is your surname. And the surname has an inherent information which the people wants, which is the caste, because in Indian society and at large, the surname characterize or reflect your caste name also, or the caste character also. So Singh is basically, as you see in the traditional belief or Hindu tradition, is associated with Rajput community. But of course, there are resistance from other religion also, like Sikhism. They have adopted Singh as a more of a caste neutral name, where whether you belong to any caste whatsoever, but Singh is a caste neutral surname which was given into the Sikhism faith. Like Kaur is also one of the like female word which transcend, which cross over this caste line of naming. Uh, and from there, I want to also situate the Dalit movement, where Chhatriyation is one, and then because the second question is about your name, and when you say Singh as a name, as your surname, they will naturally presume and assume that you are from Rajput community. And I have experience even in very modern corporate world also, where when I say my name and they assume that I'm from Rajput community, then I have to correct them. And because of the Dalit assertion and movement, I was getting that authority over my names, and I uh, contest them by saying I'm not Rajput, but Dalit and Jata more precisely, if you want to go into the caste structure. Because one has to also underline that whenever you are using a caste name, you are directly or indirectly are consolidating the same caste system. So of course there are problems, but I think it has to be seen in both manner, whether it's assertion, because, and I also want to relate it with the cases of atrocities India is having, or in just recent past. There is example from Ahmedabad, the state of Gujarat, which is known for its own development in government and statist language. And there was a case of caste atrocities. And what was the reason? Dalit man has renamed his surname with Singh. Of course, it's not Singh is in the more northern Hindi language. It was more in Gujarati on Sich, but it symbolizes the Rajput association with that surname. So what happened there in Banaskantha district of Gujarat, the Rajput dominant men of that particular area has thrashed and also beaten up that particular individual. So there is one example where your renaming act of that renaming, act of that resistance have become the sore eye of the dominant Rajput community. That is one example has to be there. And I think there's both ways, but one has to assert what they want to call themselves, because name is very personal, because personal name is about your personal identity and how do you see it. But of course there are lots of issues, there are lots of structure in which you live, in which you are born, and name are given to you at your birth, and it's mostly reflect your socio-political condition of that time. So I think I will also relate it to, but that personal experience also wants a political justification or political explanation. Why is it so? Why people are treating me with my name, with that identity, with that caste identity? In social egalitarian modern system, it should not be the case. What your name is, it's more about what your faculties are, how much you are rational in your thinking, how much you are educated. So I think these considerations are more important in uh, democratic society. But of course it's a long path to go, and one has to question the naming system, which was very much prevalent, which is very much prevalent in nowadays, in even in nowadays in contemporary world. But one has to also take into account that act, if one is naming someone, of what are the consideration of having one name, what are, and if the consideration is caste or any unequal social structure, one needs to highlight, one needs to explain it, why is it so. So it's also important that like for example, many people have problem for by using the name of Chamar. And one of the good example is from the Jata community itself, because they have demanded renaming of their own community, because they regarded Chamar as a derogatory term. But the most important part, what I am going to convey or argue is also important, not to invisibilize these inequalities. One has to say in if it is derogatory, and if it is the reality, social reality, one has to say it on the face, and then contest it and saying that the use of this word is not according to the modern socialist or egalitarian system which we believe in. So that is my point.
So, as you said, we are living in a contemporary society where, irrespective of your profession or work, no matter how highness of your profession or the work, you're always being judged by your caste and your name. Yeah.
Surely it's because of the caste is penetrated in to such a level that even the professional, even the your educational system, secular modern education system will also have that element. Even the urban most are modernized cities and spaces will also have that caste character, because it's imbibed so deeply into the Indian psyche or psychological system that one will inquire about their caste and one will treat other person according to their caste. So one has to question it, and one has to also constructively contribute uh, into making of a new belief system, which will be more egalitarian, which will be more not caste neutral but anti-caste, because it's also important to differentiate both things. So if you want to have an anti-caste system or democratic system in India, one has to question this naming system, and one has to go beyond, or go away from this hierarchical Hindu social order.
As we know how the upper caste people want to address the name of the lower caste people, but I would like to know how the members of Dalit community like to address one another. Please shed some light on the self-naming among Dalit communities and what role it plays in struggle against caste discrimination through naming.
Yeah, it's a long history, because Dalit movements also have renamed their community name or group name from time to time, and one is of because of the prevailing conditions or requirement, as and when required. For example, in Dalit community, Dalit movement itself is a product of that naming trajectory, because once they were called scheduled caste, then in if we go deeper, or we go beyond it, they were called depressed class also. But there's binary, and that contestation of giving name and taking name, I think mostly can be understood by the Gandhi naming of Dalit communities as Harijan, and Ambedkar naming of Dalit communities as Dalit, because Dalit is also product of that Dalit literature movement, that Dalit political movement, which was strong at one point of time in like in 80s and 90s. And Dalit movement has proved that how naming one community, self-naming of one community is important to assert their own space in the political realm, and also in the social realm. So and their derogatory word, if you go beyond this, beyond the status language of depressed class and scheduled caste, because it has also been criticized by Dalit scholars, that how state naming scheduled caste or depressed class is also giving you that inherent character, that which will restrict that identity, that name, to to break these traditional structure. So I think Dalit movement itself is a process where one name Dalit, as in adopted by the whole group, or the Dalits who were active in the political mobilization and participation across different parts of the country. And of course, it became important in Dalit community to focus on the naming. So as a group also, and I've also talked about their subgroup also, which were active in their political realm. I was talking about only two cases, because that is my case studies. But of course, there are other, even in intermediate castes like Yadavs and others intermediate castes. It is the case, but I want to argue from that Dalit position, and how naming is important for that Dalit group. And of course, there are debates. Even the concept of Dalit, or the naming of Dalit, has been questioned by different counters, even from the Dalit communities. Like one contestation of Mool Nivasi, or the original inhabitants, is getting somewhat voice in one section of the Dalit uh, community, and also the parallel word of Bahujan, which consists of minorities, which consist of OBCs and as well as SCs and STs. So these contestation and this grouping or group name also has to be taken in account while we talk about Dalit movement, how these categories are also present in present scenario, and one has to uh, negotiate, one has to communicate these identity, because Dalit Bahujan is also a popular term in Indian politics now, where one call oneself Dalit and Bahujan at in one go. But it's important to distinguish these two categories also, because Dalit has the experience or a shared historical experience of untouchability, while other intermediary caste do not have or did not have that historical experiences or shared historical experiences or untouchability. So I think, and also when we are talking about the nomenclature of Chamar, so there are two trends. One is doing away and getting away from the use of Chamar, but there's another trend, basically mostly popular in the state of Punjab and also into the western Uttar Pradesh, where one glorify the name of Chamar, or one take pride in into that casteist or in caste in that caste name. So I think this, it also has to be problematized in such a way that if one name is a caste name, and Ambedkar also says about on this, where he argues that the caste system will exist or will prevail or will function in Indian society, and until and unless there is a change in the naming system, there will be no and there has to be change in the naming system, because the caste name in itself carries those casteist structures between them, and one has to contest it, one has to rename it in order to contest the caste system as whole, caste structures at whole. And if one is using the caste name, the earlier caste name, the old traditional labels, then uh, somehow or in many ways they are consolidating, or they are reflecting their the given caste structure, social stratification of Indian society. So I think my argument will be to do away these traditional old, or to redefine, if there is a name, one has to redefine it, or one has to explain it why it is so, and one has to acknowledge it, to build or to construct a more equal naming system or naming convention in India.
This morning I was going through one of the article where I found that caste system is very much ingrained in the Indian people. Even if you even change your surname or even your name, you are still judged by the name you are given the earlier. You are the first name. So we have seen everyone talk about the persecution, atrocities that happen to lower caste people or Dalit people. But we find very a few people that talk about what sort of precaution we should take. In your opinion, what steps should be taken to address and combat discrimination related to naming within Dalit community? And what role do you think education, activism, and policy play in this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I must reflect one of another example where cautious, because one has to cautious if you are living in an Indian society which is very much unequal in nature, and that inequality is reflected in your day-to-day life, in your day-to-day practices. And I'll give you an example where, from Basti district of Uttar Pradesh, where a man has named their son with a similar name, with the same name as the higher caste had in that village. And it's on the record that because of that action, the dominant higher caste people have murdered that particular person, just because they have the similar or same name as the higher caste. uh, surname, personal name. It's not about the surname, but the first name. Uh, so that is one repercussion, the inhuman repercussion, or you can say illegal repercussion one can have. So uh, one have to be one has to underline these examples also, but doing so because uh, it's important to underline and specify what should be the condition, what how to deal with that. So I think it's more act of resistance. It can have these repercussion also, but I think it's more but as activism, as a political consciousness, due to your mind, or due to your action, or due to your thinking, is you were able to justify your action in that sense. And it's important to justify, or it's important to explain why is it so. If you are changing the name, if you are renaming oneself, if you are renaming the community as whole, one has to justify, one has to give reason why is it so. So I think then that the problem of caste in Indian scenario can be addressed. I'm not talking about solving it through the naming system, but addressing this problem, and to locate this problem in our names, because names are an integral part of our society, in one psyche, or in one individual, or in our friend circle, or in our class, or in our education system, like in a university, or when you are recognized by the state by different documentation. That is also needs to be underlined, where your name must justify, must have reason why there has to be the need to change the name. And I think one has to address it, one has to pose this argument in such a manner. Of course it can have repercussion, like higher caste can murder you, but I think the act of resistance is more important, and the idea of resisting in, or in that symbiotic resistance of naming is also important.
One of major part or significant part of your research was the political dimension. So, can you explain the political dimension of naming practices among Dalit communities and the struggle and political surrounding within them? And what is the political dimension of naming practices among Dalit communities and the struggle and the political behind them?
It's an interesting question, and one must reflect, highlight this political connotation also, because uh, as a student of political science, one has to understand how the state gives you certain names, and what are their objective, or is there any resistance from the community at the social and their personal level. So I can give you example of how in current scenario, how the status language of scheduled caste uh, is being fought, or is being resisted by the naming of Dalit itself. And just few years back, the government of India has issued a notice that one cannot use Dalit as an in government language, in government documentation, because they want to use scheduled caste over Dalit, because it is a status language. But on the contrary, have Dalit scholars have their view that one do not want that recognition from the state if one wants to assert or recognize themselves. So I think Dalit has a shared historical experience, where scheduled caste is more of a technical term which does not define, by the name itself, does not define or does not explain what sort of category it is. So I think more the political dimension, the state wants to recognize by their own name, which is scheduled caste, which will not reflect, which will not explain the Dalit character, or the Dalit history, or the Dalit culture, or the Dalit assertion, or the Dalit movement. But it can only be characterized by self-naming, by movements. And Dalit is the example where government also wants you to use their terminology as against the Dalit assertion or Dalit movement ideology or history, or that particular political assertion. So I think Indian state is also are having that engagement or from Dalit, or resistance from the Dalit communities at large, because uh, self-naming is a very political act, and when you are doing it while de-recognizing the status language and recognizing or claiming the self naming by Dalit itself. So I think it's a good contestation where the state and the society or the political group of Dalit are engaging or fighting or resisting each other. One point is that, and there are examples from international cases where states have somehow meddle or somehow interfere with the naming system, social naming system. Also, it's example of Turkey. You can take the example of Cultural Revolution in China, and there are very many political changes which subsequently change the naming behavior or the popular names among the citizens or the population of the particular nation, state, or the country. So I think that is one important thing. But as far as Indian state is concerned, so I have read about one law, and that is Goa's surname law. But the objective and the detailing and what the content of that law means, that there is need to uh, have a restriction on the change of surname on the pretext of migrated population, on the pretext of recognizing them in the caste certificates. Now, state, and it's only one law where the naming of the society or the naming of the individual were concerned. But my problem is that that law in itself says that one need not to change the surname in order to recognize by the state. So it's a veiled contestation or a veiled warning from the state that if you change your name, you will not recognize and you will not get the benefits of the social justice or the reservation mechanism that we have in our Indian democratic constitutional framework. So, but I think the law or the state, what state, Indian state should uh, do, or how to engage with it, I think Indian state should recognize that there is a problem, and when this problem will not be solved by not uh, changing or restricting the naming system, which was, as I convey, as I argue, is mostly based on the traditional uh, caste social division of the society. So I think that is interesting example. I hope, because other uh, states have time to time engage with this naming convention, and Indian state is much more behind, uh, because of course the Indian society is having that character of that rigidness, of that rigid hierarchical inequality. So I think state has to take that for step forward and recognize these inequalities or in these discrimination in the law also. So I think, but of course it's a long way, and one of the way is to talk about it, one of the way to take the research level to towards it, one of the way to is politically mobilize the issue on public sphere. So that is also important, of course. And if I'm talking about the political sphere, one has to mobilize uh, different groups who are affected, who are discriminated on the basis of naming. But it's a wrong route. And what Indian state should do is to recognize these complexities and these problems in our Indian traditional naming system. Not the type of the what Goa surname law was doing. It's more on restricting this naming system, indirectly consolidating those naming structures. And second of all, also wants to give a real warning that state recognition is important. It has to be recognized only by our name, by, for example, as the notification of Indian government, which says, government of India, which says that you have to use the status language as in place of the Dalit, or in place of that political assertive name.
That is really interesting to find that. Thank you for sharing this. So, your research has two case studies of the Jatip subcaste, of the Chamar caste, and the Ravidasi community that relates to the larger question of naming and caste in India. Can you please elaborate on the approach of same Jatip authors that disputes being called as untouchable and the impact of this on their political mobilization?
I will take Ram Narayan Rawat into this account because he has written a book on Chamars, and he take this name in the title only. Of course, there were controversy at that time, and he talks about how cultural stereotyping has been an important element in names, in caste name. For example, Chamars. Now, at one point, or whenever you invoke the Chamar name, you will get that traditional naming or traditional occupational label which this name has, which is mostly in popular notion or in belief notion is about leatherworking. But it's not like that. Chamar was also agrarian class, and it was mentioned in British census also in 1891 British census. It was mentioned that, and they have underlined that there is a problem where one caste name is being stereotyped for or being associated with the traditional occupation level, uh, which may be not the case in the society. For example, Chamars was also agrarian laborers, were also producers. Producer in the sense they were also having contribution in the production system uh, from the working class. But because there is a stereotype, because there is a labeling connected with the occupational system, one has to question it and wants to underline it with own objective, that one has to do away with that caste based occupational system associated with name also. So when and of course there are other engagement, and they are different. I can give you a few example where from Punjab there's adi dharma, adharma connotation was adopted, or name was adopted in uh, challenging the earlier Chamar nomenclature. And they also want, this is basically the natural trajectory of Ravidasiya belief system, or Ravidasiya culture system, which talks about engaging both at both level, whether it's caste or whether it's religion. So it's a interplay or intermix of caste and religious category, where they adopt a newer religion, a separate religion. Of course, at that time when Manguram was the leader of Dalit movement in Punjab, it was Adharmi or Adi Dharma, and then it was converted into some sort of which we call Ravidasiya at whole. Uh, uh, and of course, in Uttar Pradesh, there is a current of Adi Hindu. Now, one can see these Adi Dharma and Adharmi, or Adi Hindu in the same logical colori of Mool Nivasi, where they were arguing that Dalits are the inhabitants. And as you know, there is a Aryan invasion theory, and there is a explanation where Central Asia, or larger Asia, was the part from where the Vedic culture, or this culture system came into India. So that is one contestation from these cultural groups, which is not just the cultural, uh, uh, which does not have that cultural objective, but their political objective also. For example, Manguram or Adharmi movement had demanded to rename their name in the caste recognition or scheduled caste category, and they have successfully done so, and even Jatavs have done so successfully. And also want to highlight that because we are talking also about the state, and one has to engage with the British state also in doing the history of naming system, and how Dalit have engaged in the naming system. So at one point of time, British government has recognized Jatav as a separate name, but in the same line or in the same point as Chamar in the bracket as a subgroup, but Jata movement or Jata association at that time were more demanded a separate identity. Jata, but within the scheduled caste, because they also believe that they have a shared historical experience, but in doing so they also want to have that space, that democratic space. So I think that's also important, how culture, social and political are interlinked in this naming explanation and this contesting of naming system itself. So I think these are the few examples where we can locate the answer of your uh, question.
Okay. My last question is, how does Ravidasi community's formation of a new religion outside the order of the Hindu fold serve as a strategy for resisting caste and caste names?
Yeah, of course. Well, I have a fieldwork on Ravidasya faith also, because I've visited Ravidasya temple uh, in Banaras or Varanasi, or what we call Kashi in older times. So basically, Varanasi is the birthplace of Guru Ravidas, Sant Ravidas, whatever one can call him, or Ravidas in that sense, or Redas in another language. Uh, so they were very conscious about the point that why we should call ourselves as Ravidas, separate from Chamar or separate from the other identities which were given to them. But Ravidasya is more of a division or a resistant wing of the Sikhism itself, because as you know, Ravidasya as a religion was formed, officially recognized in 2010, and it was basically a development between a political development as a result of the conflicting interest of Dalit group and the higher caste group within Sikhism only, because Sikhism also having that Jat domination character, and I have talked to people, and many people were saying that they were not allowed to enter the Gurudwara. I'm not talking about Mandir or temple. I'm talking about the Gurudwara, and how intermediate caste and scheduled caste were not able to enter those structures or those belief system. And that's why it became imperative or but natural to uh, construct a more separate autonomous religious or the social order where one can have, because they are also clear, and we are as a political scientist, one needs to underline, they were also clear of the point that why should we not call ourselves a Chamar, why should we not call ourselves with the other Hindu or Sikhism identity, because earlier the Guru Granth Sahib was the holy book of their followers, including the Dalit followers, Sikh Dalit followers within that ambit. But now they have Amrit Bani. Amrit Bani is basically the text was believed to be written by Ravidas only. But of course, Guru Granth Sahib is also having a section of Ravidas, but is more of a contestation with these underlying religion also in these minorities also in Indian scenario, where they have uh, proved, or they want to have that objective to have a separate and autonomous identity. And it's not about just the Hindu, because Hindu is one block, and then I from what I am perceiving or what I'm arguing, Sikhism is a sense, has given a sense of resistance at one point of time, because it was against the caste structure prevailing, and in that point, and many Sikh gurus talks about caste. And for example, I have taken the example how caste neutral name or surname were given to the followers of Sikhism, but of course there are Brahminical tendencies within these. It's not about just India, but I think South Asian context, where caste penetrate even into different minorities also, whether it is Sikhism, whether it is Islam, whether it's other minority, and one has to talk about it while dealing the case at the deeper level. That's not just about the majority, but how minorities are also being victim or being placed at the helm of that Brahminical super notion or supremacy or hegemony in these structures. So I think Gavidasya case is important in that manner, and one has to to also take account of the religion while talking about the caste structure, while talking, because I also talked about how Hindu religious texts have something to say on naming system, how Dalit movement has asserted over the time, and how there are different religious current who contested caste system in past, but somehow they also evolved, or they also inculcate that Brahminical values just because of the cultural hegemonic structure they are having. One has to question that also. One has to restrict, one has to give them no entry in their belief system because of the fundamental issue they are having with the caste. Like Buddhism is an important example, where it also talks about how the caste should be eradicated and why there is a need for uh, uh, anti-caste world order or social order. And one has to underline, one has to carry forward these fundamental beliefs of the minorities, or the religious resistant groups, which has to be the case study further, and also want to conclude on these categories, whether it's a religion, whether it's a caste, whether it's a gender. Naming is one which prescribe you these identities, and also prescribe you personal name based on these identities, these requirements, these specificities. So I think uh, that is one important point. And from these analysis, or from these research, one has to say the problem in calling oneself a name, and one has to question, is this the name which the person has taken, or is this the name which the society and so-called dominant section of the society has given to them. So I think that is the main connotation one has to keep in mind. And also, if there is a change, why there was a change in name, and what are the reason why one has to change the name, because it has to have some reason, foundational reason, where, because name is one thing which you use many times in a day. Your name also, and your other uh, companion name, or your uh, colleague's name, or your other individuals in the society on which you are interacting. So the process of political interaction and social interaction also needs to be explained in such a manner, in order to explain the politics of naming at large in Indian society, and to also locate caste, gender, and religion, these categories, these social categories, which of course is based on the hierarchical system. And if we believe in the democratic egalitarian ethos of Indian constitution, or the what the Indian modern democratic world should be, so I think that must be underlined, and that is the path one has to follow. Of course, it's a long path, but I think one has to follow, one has to go forward on these platforms, while dealing with these categories, gender, religion, and caste at once, and and putting them into a daily life, and putting them into a daily uh, connotation of our name, and into the social politics. What I say is, in my work, is the social politics which is at working. One needs to highlight, I mean, one needs to argue from these places.
That's really rightfully said. I totally agree with you. So I feel like the bottom line of our talk show is that the religion, the caste, or any creed that you belong, but you're always judged by your name.
And name are based
Yeah.
on those structure which needs to be questioned.
Yeah. With that said, thank you very, very much, Mr. Singh, for taking time out for this interview. This was really insightful.
So thank you, Hemant, for inviting me. Thank you, South Asia Research Institute for Minorities, to inviting me, and to have my word in your platform. And I'm very much thankful for that platform. I'm very much thankful to you